We're here at downtown Denison. We're going to be talking about Dwight D. Eisenhower. And before we get into too much, too deep, too far into his life, let's start where everybody is sort of introduced to him, his military career. And people they typically think General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Obviously, you have to start somewhere, but he wasn't a general until when?
He did not become a general until 2 months before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And he was only a one-star general. That means he only commanded a brigade, but, I mean, again, he really wasn't a combat general. He was working for MacArthur, he was working for George C. Marshall, so he was not out on the field.
Yeah, and MacArthur and George C. Marshall really, they noticed how brilliant Dwight D. Eisenhower was. And they knew that he could be really utilized, but there was no war going on.
Correct.
You know, it had had World War I, and he was training soldiers. He wanted to go fight in France. They didn't let him go fight in France because they wanted him training soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, he was a good organizer, a good manager, so this is where, and he was very good in diplomacy, so this is where his, his skills came in.
Yeah, his diplomatic skills really came in after he became a one-star general and two-star, and then they moved him up to Supreme Allied Commander.
Right.
That's where the diplomatic skills come in. But before then, he's involved in North Africa.
Operation Torch took place on November 8, 1942.
Right.
Now, Joseph Stalin, he was the dictator of the Soviet Union, wanted a second front immediately to relieve them of the Germans. But, our guys were not ready. And, Eisenhower wanted the men trained. He didn't want to do like World War I where the men were just thrown into the meat grinder. So, there was Operation Torch was to land on North Africa because the Germans and the Italians were fighting in Egypt at that time. The Battle of El Alamein was what turned things around in Egypt when Montgomery defeated Rommel.
Eisenhower has the success, moves on to what?
He moves on to Sicily. Now, this is where Eisenhower's diplomatic skills come in. There were, we talked about Stalin wanting the second front. Now, he had to juggle not only his own generals, but he also had to juggle Montgomery, who was British. He had to juggle Churchill and FDR and
all the politics.
Right. So now Churchill was saying that Sicily and Italy would be the soft underbelly of Europe. So, there was a discussion, should we go in Sicily, should we go in Greece? But the plan was, we'll go to Sicily and Italy, knock Italy out of the war. And that part worked. We did land in Sicily, Operation Husky, and then we landed in Italy, Operation Avalanche. And when we landed in Italy at Salerno, Italy, they surrendered, and then they switched sides. They got rid of Mussolini. So it was a good strategy to some extent, although the fighting in Italy was a lot tougher than expected. That's Anzio, for instance.
Right.
A brutal campaign. So, this is where Eisenhower's diplomatic skills came in. It's also where Patton got himself in trouble in Sicily, where he slapped those two soldiers. So he had to deal with Patton because he knew Patton was the guy who got stuff done.
And Patton and Eisenhower knew each other from way back, before the war started.
There were two slapping incidences. After that, he had to recall him. He eventually goes to England, where Patton was doing his diplomatic skills, which really were not that good.
Yeah.
But Eisenhower had to deal with all that. Montgomery had his own ego. Patton and Montgomery did not like each other.
Right.
But again, this is where Eisenhower's skills came in.
So there is your Eisenhower information on getting into World War II, North Africa campaign, the Italian campaign. We're going to get to D-Day. Okay, so I want to talk about the D-Day invasion, which is something that Dwight Eisenhower is most known for. He was Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. And we often say, okay, the weight of the free world is on the president's shoulders. Literally, the weight of the free world was on Ike's shoulders at the moment of early June to make the decision, do we do this D-Day invasion?
Correct. It was all on him. He was the final say. He was the one who made the final decision. It was supposed to be on June the 5th, but because the storms in the English Channel were so bad, he had to postpone it at least 24 hours when they found a window of opportunity. Had the mission failed, which was possible, He was prepared to, he had a note, a speech ready to put all the blame on him. Don't blame the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen, this is all on me. There had been previous invasions that had failed. Gallipoli is an example. There was a raid in France known as the Dieppe raid with the Canadians 2 years prior. So it was possible the invasion would fail. So we went in, he went ahead, he made a speech. He made a speech about the Great Crusade. He went and spoke to the individual divisions. We had 3 airborne divisions, 2 American, 1 British, and then we had the 5 beachheads. Omaha and Utah were the American,
right.
And then we had the British and the Canadians. So he said
it was a huge gamble.
It was a huge gamble.
It was a huge gamble.
Yeah,
because if the Germans had found out if they had gotten a whiff of it, it would have been an absolute disaster. And we talk about the Omaha Beach, and we talk about that pretty often. Like Omaha Beach was just cataclysmic.
Slaughter. It was so bad. They knew that it was going to be bad. That's why they used 2 divisions.
Yeah.
Utah had 1 division, but Omaha they had to use 2 divisions on that beach because they knew it was going to be a slaughter, and it was. And thank God we did not have social media back then, because they managed to keep it a secret. There were ways that they were letting them think that we're going to land in Calais. Yeah. They used Patton as a diversion.
This was the biggest amphibious invasion in history, and the Germans never got a whiff of it. In fact, Rommel went on vacation, right?
Yeah.
It was his wife's birthday.
Wife's birthday.
You had Hitler, who was taking a 24-hour nap,
he was all drugged up.
Yeah, so they were just completely sort of blindsided by this taking place.
Right, I mean, like I said, had this failed, it would have set the Western Front back maybe another year.
Now, what does that say about the character of Eisenhower and the trust that people had in him to make that decision? Not just Americans or the American government trusting him to make that decision.
The whole world.
But yeah,
the whole world, all of Europe. I mean, Hitler occupied almost all of Europe, and so this was a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, if it failed, there was the thing with the Soviets that were coming in, because at the time the Soviets had the upper hand. So here's a scenario that a lot of people don't think about. Had the invasion failed and Germany was defeated by the Soviet Union, the Soviets could have kept going and captured the remainder of Western Europe on their own. And, there were 44 years of the Iron Curtain that the Soviets didn't relinquish. They could have had all of Europe for 40, 45 years. So, I mean, imagine what it would have looked like, how Europe would have looked like. So,
now, we ended up getting through Normandy. We got through France. We got through Belgium.
Okay.
How did we get through to the end of the war and do it successfully with everybody on board?
Well, it reminds me a little bit of George Washington, how Washington had to hold 13 different countries together. The colonies had to hold them together and keep them together because, believe me, they did not always get along with each other. Britain and France had a history of not liking each other. In fact, the Vichy French, when it was Vichy France, the Vichy French and the British were fighting each other in North Africa, in the Levant. So I mean that in and of itself was difficult. Then you had Polish, you had the Polish government exile, the Netherlands, you had the Norwegians. So you had all these different groups, Canadians. You had countries from around the world all contributing. That Eisenhower had to keep them all together, keep them focused. Yeah. I mean, believe me, there were a lot of American soldiers and airmen in London that were courting the British women, and the Brits did not like that at all.
No, not at all.
So he had to keep all that together.
Us Americans. Yeah.
But not only that, you also have to think about, you had Patton and you had Montgomery, who hated each other. Patton wanted to go right into Germany, but he had to stop because of logistics and the fact that Montgomery wanted to go into Holland for Operation Market Garden because the Germans were launching V-1 and V-2 rockets that were wreaking havoc on London. So, and Montgomery had this plan. That's where a bridge too far comes in. Market Garden, the plan was to go all the way, capture all these bridges, and then we would be able to cross the Rhine at Arnhem. If we had captured Arnhem and kept it, we were across the Rhine. That was the last great barrier into the heart of Germany. So theoretically, it would have been a good plan had it worked, but there were too many what-ifs. It failed. and it delayed the invasion into Germany. We had the Battle of the Bulge that took place in December, right around the time when Eisenhower got his 5th star. We won the Battle of the Bulge, and then we kept going, and then the last barrier, again, was the Rhine. We managed to cross it when one of the bridges at Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge, failed to blow up. We cut in.
One bridge.
One bridge, and then Patton had his pontoon bridges. They started building pontoon bridges across the Rhine, and at that point, we were pouring into the heart of Germany, and the Soviets were coming in from the east. So you ended up having the Germans sandwiched in between. And now here's an interesting thing: is that Eisenhower knew that everybody wanted to capture Berlin. Everybody, the Americans, the British, the French, everyone wanted to go in there. But Eisenhower knew that was going to be a costly battle. There were,
he had reached out to Omar Bradley and was like, what do you think? And Omar Bradley said it could cost somewhere around 100,000 American casualties.
Correct.
And he goes, I think that's probably too stiff of a cost, especially, as he said, especially since we're going to have to give a portion of it back to the Soviets anyway.
Right. They knew that was going to happen.
And that's another testament to Eisenhower, that he's the guy who has control over everything. He has the last say throughout this whole thing, and he listens to Omar Bradley, his subordinate.
Yes.
And he takes his word, and he's like, okay.
He was smart enough to let his generals, Bradley, Patton, Hodges, to plan the tactics. So he was not a tactician, he was a strategist.
Right.
His job was to do the overall strategy, what's the overall end goal. But he was a great manager in that he let his generals do a lot of the thinking. They consulted with him. Like when the Battle of the Bulge took place, he's like, gentlemen, what are we going to do? And Patton was like, I can swing in 48 hours and go straight towards Bastogne. That was Patton's plan. And Eisenhower's like, if you can do it, go for it.
Do it. Yep.
So
the next conversation we're going to have is about Eisenhower's presidency and
what he
two
did.
terms.
Yeah, two terms.
And there was a reason why he won in landslide, victories.
Other than the fact that he went against Adlai Stevenson twice.
Sadly for Adlai.
Yeah.
All right.
I like that. Sadly for Adlai.
All right, so we should have a shootout since that's the Red River.
I'm from Oklahoma. I was born there.
Oh yeah, I wish you were still there. Anyways, we're on Carpenter's Bluff Bridge. We're going to talk about Eisenhower's presidency.
Yes.
And to an extent, what led up to it.
Yeah, he had quite a bit of accomplishments. He won or helped win the European War against Nazi Germany. He was the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, which meant he had overall command of the United States, Canada, Britain, all the Allied nations on the Western Front. And then he carried on that power when he became the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO when the Cold War started.
And then, to top everything off, president of Columbia University.
Yeah, not bad for an Ivy League school,
There you go. And an old, Texas native.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and then he was elected
in
1952. Richard Nixon was his running mate on the Republican ticket. They won Texas. In fact, they won a majority of the states. It was a landslide against Adlai Stevenson. Funny thing is that 4 years later in the 56 election, it was the same thing. Eisenhower ran against Adlai Stevenson. Same result, only Eisenhower actually gained a few more states in the 56 election.
It's funny, during his time, you're having the height of the Cold War.
Correct.
The guy who was the president prior to Eisenhower was Truman. The Korean War had broken out over there. That was one of his campaign promises in 52 was, I will go to Korea.
Yeah.
And he did that. And shortly after he became president, well, two things happened. He became president, Stalin died, and the Korean War ended in July of 53. But there were some other things that he did that sort of was that push against communism.
Well, yeah, during this era, there was a lot of communism being spread around the world. Now, in 54, the French lost Indochina, and so you had, Laos, Cambodia, North and South Vietnam were created. And, he gave a lot of money and aid to South Vietnam to aid them because they were the anti-communist government. You also had Taiwan. There were some moments, especially in 58, when we almost went to war with Red China over the defense of Taiwan, also known as Formosa. There were other things going on. Berlin. This was when, the Soviets were, the Berlin Wall hadn't been built by this time, but they were applying a lot of pressure to kick the French, British, and Americans out of Berlin, and he stood firm and prevented it.
And we have to keep in mind the reason why we were there and the British were there and the French were there is that Germany had been broken up after the war.
Yeah, it was partitioned in 4 different ways, and then you had Berlin was partitioned in 4 sections.
Yeah.
So he stood firm against the Soviets. They wanted to kick him out. Now there were other accomplishments. The interstate highway system. That's because of Eisenhower. He started NASA. He signed the bill to create NASA.
Yeah, he did that in 1958.
Yeah. And now the year before that, he signed the Civil Rights Bill. There was a big thing going on in Arkansas, and he made sure that the federal government supported the Supreme Court, make sure that the schools were not going to be segregated. Mm-hmm. So he was behind all that. In 1956, he had the Suez Crisis.
Yeah.
Now, Eisenhower was not a big fan of colonialism. And he was working with some of the countries to rid themselves of colonialism, being that, we were once a colonial country and we wanted to rid ourselves of European domination. So, he worked with Egypt, he worked with several countries to get them, their freedom. Now in 1956, when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the British were
and he was the leader of Egypt.
He was the president of Egypt at the time. So Britain and France were major shareholders of the Suez Canal. So when it was nationalized, they were like, this is not going to work. So Israel invaded the Sinai. You had shipping closed to Israel by Egypt. So Israel responded. They invaded the Sinai. And Britain and France used that as an excuse to invade the Suez Canal area. It became a big mess. But Eisenhower, based on his principles, stood firm, and he told Britain and France and Israel that they need to withdraw. He was not about to let Britain and France retake the Suez Canal. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there was also a crisis in Hungary at the time. The Hungarians kicked the communists out, but the Soviets invaded Hungary, and this angered Eisenhower because he felt that the West had no moral standing to defend the Hungarians against the Soviets if we were going into Egypt. So that led to a change of power in England and France. The following year, now this is after he was reelected, he created what was known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. Now the Eisenhower Doctrine was that any Middle Eastern nation, if they need help, whether it's us fighting or whether it's us providing aid, we will do it. We'll give them aid. And so in July 15th of 1958, the U.S. Marines went into Lebanon to help support the government there, the pro-Western government, against Nasser and Syria. At the time they were united. It was known as the United Arab Republic. He kept us out of war. So many times we could have gone to war with either Red China or the Soviet Union, but he had a cool head and he kept us out. Even the U-2 incident with Francis Gary Powers, that was a major embarrassment for him, but it didn't lead to a conflict.
So 2 terms in office, and at the end, he gave his farewell address, which has become one of the most famous speeches in American history.
Right. He warned the American people about the military-industrial complex. That was one of his last parting shots. To warn America, don't let policy be run by wars. Don't let the people who create the military hardware lead us into wars so that we can keep those companies going. And like I said, he kept us out of war. There were chances, there were opportunities to go to war. He saw what war did. He saw Europe in 1944 and 45. What war does to the world.
Right.
So he was, he just wanted to make sure that it didn't happen. Now, as he was leaving office, he also aided John F. Kennedy as the president, that's what's so great about America, because his running mate, Richard Nixon, ran against John Kennedy. Nixon was defeated by Kennedy, and instead of just saying, you know what, I'm not going to help you out, he aided his friend's Victor, aided him into transitioning into the government and running the federal government.
So, Supreme Allied Commander, NATO Commander, Columbia University President, and 2-term president. He had all this power, and he never got a big head.